The Aelan warship had been obliterated. Shattered metal floated through the void of space, the wreckage of what was once a proud battleship of the Thailand Empire. Fires still burned in the lifeless husks of smaller ships, their twisted remains drifting silently. Among the debris, a single human warship remained intact, its hull scared but victorious. Inside the ship, past the cold metal corridors and the humming energy cores, a dark room awaited. The interrogation chamber. It was small, barely more than a reinforced cell, its walls lined with energy dampeners. In the center sat a silent commander, bound by shimmering restraints that pulsed faintly with light. He was tall, with dark, scaled skin and glowing yellow eyes that gleamed under the dim overhead lights. His breathing was steady, his expression calm. He was not afraid. Across from him, a human intelligence officer stood, his face blank as he observed the alien prisoner. The officer asked questions. His voice was firm, his tone practiced. But the Thailand did not respond. He simply stared back, unbothered, unimpressed. A second officer stepped forward, this one flanked by two artificial intelligence drones. Their sleek metallic forms hovered beside him, their digital eyes scanning the Thailand for any sign of weakness. One drone spoke, its voice synthetic yet sharp. Subject remains uncooperative. Probability of voluntary information disclosure, less than 1%. Still, that Island said nothing. He merely smirked, the corners of his mouth curling ever so slightly. The humans tried again. They presented images of destroyed colonies, of planets burned to ash by the Thailand fleet. They spoke of the billions who had died, of the cities reduced to rubble, of the children lost to war. They demanded answers. They threatened. They reasoned. The Thailand did not flinch. He had been trained for this. He was not weak like the humans. Minutes passed, then hours. The interrogation was failing. The intelligence officers exchanged glances. This was getting them nowhere. The Island fleet was out there, regrouping, preparing to strike again. They needed information. Now. Then, the door to the chamber slid open. A man stepped inside. He was different from the others. No pristine uniform, no military badges. He wore a simple jacket, the fabric worn from years of service. A scar ran across his left cheek, a reminder of battles long past. He was older than the officers, yet there was something about him, something that made the room feel smaller. He was calm, too calm. The Xylan's yellow eyes studied him, but the man didn't react. He didn't sit at the interrogation table. He didn't bring drones or weapons. He simply walked forward, grabbed a chair, and turned it around before sitting on it backward. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he exhaled and leaned forward. You ever hear about the Battle of New Helsinki? The Thailand narrowed his eyes, but did not respond. The man, Bonner, smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something the other did not. You see, Bonner continued, there was this outpost. Just a little colony, nothing special. About 3,000 people. Scientists, engineers, families. They weren't soldiers, weren't fighters, just humans living their lives. The Thailand remained silent. Bonner sighed, shaking his head. And then your people showed up. A flicker of amusement crossed the Thailand's face. He had no memory of this so-called battle, but he knew how the Island Empire operated. If a colony was in their way, it was erased. Efficient, ruthless, absolute. Bonner continued. The Island fleet came in hard. Orbital bombardment. Plasma fire. No warnings. No survivors. His voice was steady, almost casual, but there was something cold beneath it. At least, that's what you thought. The Xylan's smirk faded slightly. See, when the attack started, most of our people were underground, working in the mining tunnels. That's the only reason any of them made it. About 40 survivors. No weapons, no armor, Just miners and scientists trapped on a burning rock. Bonner leaned back slightly, stretching his arms. You know what happened next. The Thailand said nothing. Bonner's eyes darkened. They fought back. The Thailand let out a quiet, dismissive exhale. Impossible. He finally spoke, his voice deep and firm. Bonner chuckled. Yeah, that's what the first Thailand strike team thought, too. He leaned forward again, his voice dropping lower. You underestimated us. Thought we'd just curl up and die. But humans, we don't die easy. Those survivors, they turned the mines into a fortress. They used old drilling lasers, explosives meant for rock, even sharpened tools. They set traps, ambushes. They made you bleed. The Xylan's amusement was gone now. Bonner nodded slowly. Took your people 3 weeks to clear that colony. 3 weeks to wipe out 40 civilians. 40 humans with no training, no gear, and no chance. He tilted his head. Tell me, how does an empire as mighty as yours struggle against people with mining equipment? The Xylan's jaw tightened. He did not answer. Bonner sighed, rubbing his temples. See, that's the problem with your kind. You think you're invincible. You think technology wins wars. But war isn't about weapons. It's about who's willing to go further. A silence filled the room. The energy restraints hummed softly. Then, Bonner reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. He placed it on the table and tapped it once. A hologram flickered to life. A live transmission. A voice crackled through the speaker, speaking in the Xylan tongue. The Xylan's eyes widened. It was his fleet. They sounded worried, unable to locate Commander Jorah. Human interference suspected. Systems compromised. The Xylan's breathing changed. Bonner watched him, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice almost lazy. You think you're winning this war, don't you? The Xylan looked at the hologram. He listened to his fleet's confusion, their uncertainty. He heard the fear creeping into their voices. Bonner took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. Your fleet isn't coming for you, he said, his voice softer now, more dangerous. And by the time they figure that out, it'll be too late. The Thailand commander clenched his jaw. But Bonner could see it now, the first crack in his armor. Bonner smiled. Now let's try this again. Tell me what I want to know. The Thailand commander's breathing was steady, but Bonner could see the tension creeping in. It was subtle. The way his fingers twitched slightly against the energy restraints, the way his glowing yellow eyes darted ever so briefly toward the hologram. He was still trying to look in control, but Bonner had seen this before. It was the same look soldiers got when they realized the battle wasn't going the way they thought it would. The look of doubt. Bonner smirked, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. He picked up his coffee cup again, taking another slow sip, savoring the silence. The Xylan remained rigid, but his muscles had tensed slightly. He didn't like the silence. He didn't like the waiting. That was good. That meant the cracks were getting wider. Bonner set his cup down with a quiet clink. Then, without looking at the Xylan, he spoke. You ever heard of a man named Captain Reyes? His tone was casual, like he was talking to an old friend at a bar. The Thailand didn't respond, but his jaw tightened slightly. Bonner saw it. Of course you haven't, Bonner continued, his voice smooth, calm. Your people don't remember names. Just numbers, statistics, casualties, losses. He let out a soft chuckle. That's the problem with you, Thailand. You think war is about calculations, efficiency, strength in numbers. He tilted his head, studying the alien like a scientist examining a specimen. But war is personal. The Xylan's eyes narrowed. Your mind tricks will not work on me, human. His voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Bonner smiled. Who said anything about tricks? He tapped a finger against the table, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm just telling you a story. The Xylan scoffed but said nothing. Bonner sighed dramatically. All right, I'll make it quick. Captain Reyes. He was stationed on Outpost Echo 4. Small place. Barely worth mentioning. But your people decided it was a threat, so you sent a fleet. He gestured vaguely with his hand. Your standard approach. Orbital bombardment. Boots on the ground. Eliminate everything that moves. Clean. Efficient. Effective. The Thailand's expression remained blank, but Bonner could tell he was listening. Bonner leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice dropped slightly, drawing the alien in. Except, it wasn't. See, you expected the usual resistance. Soldiers with rifles. Artillery. Maybe a few airstrikes. But what you got? He chuckled softly, shaking his head. You got Reyes. The Thailand didn't react, but Bonner could see the way his breathing had changed. Slightly deeper, he was paying attention now. Reyes didn't fight like your kind expected. He didn't set up defenses, didn't hold the line. He didn't do what was logical. No, he and his team went underground. Disappeared. And then, the killing started. The Xylan's glowing eyes flickered. Bonner's smile didn't fade. First, your command post went dark. No alarms. No warnings. Just silence. Then your supply drops started vanishing. Entire storage units gone overnight. Your people started whispering, saying there were ghosts in the tunnels. That the humans weren't dead. That they were watching. That Axylan clenched his jaw. Bonner's voice remained steady, calm. Then your officers started turning up dead. Not from gunfire. No plasma wounds. No explosions. Just dead. Throats slit. Spines severed. No sign of who did it. No idea how. Every morning, more of your people were gone. He leaned in slightly. And you know the best part. Silence. Bonner smirked. Reyes never had more than 10 men with him. The Xylan's nostrils flared slightly. He didn't like that. 10 humans against a full Xylan invasion force. Bonner tapped the table lightly. Took your fleet 4 months to realize you weren't fighting an army. Just 10 ghosts in the dark. He chuckled, shaking his head. Your kind doesn't understand fear. Not real fear. Not the kind that eats away at you, makes you second-guess every step. But Reyes? He understood it perfectly. That Xylan inhaled slowly through his nose, his fingers twitching again against his restraints. Bonner was pushing him, dragging him deeper into the game. Bonner's voice softened. See, that's the difference between your kind and mine. You fight wars like equations. We fight wars like nightmares. He leaned forward again, his tone quieter now, almost thoughtful. You ever notice how, in all your battles with humans, we always start the same way? The Xylan's jaw tightened. Your fleets burn. Bonner nodded. Yeah, we lose a lot, don't we? Outgunned. Outmatched. We take heavy casualties. But then, he let the words hang in the air. Then we start adapting. We learn. We figure out what makes you tick. And once we do, he let out a slow, knowing exhale. You stop winning. The Xylan's breathing had changed. Slightly faster now. He knew it was true. He had seen it. That Xylan Empire had crushed countless civilizations before. But humans were different. They never broke the way other species did. They fought back. Harder. Smarter. More ruthless than anything that Xylan had ever encountered. Bonner studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket again and pulled out another device. He placed it on the table, right next to the first one. A second hologram flickered to life. This time, it wasn't a transmission. It was a video feed. The Xylan's eyes flicked to the image, and for the first time, Bonner saw it. Fear. The screen showed the Xylan fleet. His fleet. The warships were wrong. Their movements were erratic, their formations broken. Emergency lights flashed across their command centers. Officers shouted over each other, panic clear in their voices. Something was happening. Bonner tilted his head, watching the alien carefully. Then he spoke, his voice almost gentle. "You know what you're looking at, don't you?" The Thailand didn't respond, but his breathing was heavier now. Bonner exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. "You thought we were interrogating you. You thought we were trying to break you. But the truth is," he gestured toward the screen, "this was never about you." The Xylan's lips parted slightly, as if about to speak, but no words came. Bonner leaned in one last time. "We weren't interrogating you. We were studying you." The silence in the room was deafening. Bonner let the words settle before finally leaning back in his chair, stretching his arms. "So, my friend," he said, picking up his coffee again, "how about you start talking before there's no fleet left for you to go back to?" The Thailand commander stared at the screen. His yellow eyes, once filled with arrogance, were now clouded with something else. Doubt. Bonner took another sip of coffee. The game was over. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the energy restraints and the quiet crackling of the hologram. The Thailand commander's glowing yellow eyes were locked onto the screen, his breathing slow but uneven. He was trying to remain still, to hide his reaction, but Bonner could see it, the slight tension in his jaw, the stiffness in his shoulders. The alien was cracking. Bonner didn't rush him. He didn't press. Instead, he simply sat there, letting the weight of the moment do the work for him. The X-Island fleet was falling apart, and the commander knew it. He had seen the confusion in his soldiers' voices, the disarray of their formations. For the first time, that Thailand weren't the ones in control. And that realization was eating away at him. Bonner sighed and leaned back, stretching his arms. "It's funny," he said casually, like he was reminiscing about an old memory. "Most species crack the moment things start going wrong. You take away their weapons, break their fleets, and they surrender. But you, Cylon." He shook his head. "You don't surrender, do you? You fight to the last breath." Admirable, in a way. The Thailand didn't move, but Bonner could see the conflict in his eyes. The alien wanted to say something, to push back, to regain control. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Bonner continued. "That's what makes this so much more satisfying." He nodded toward the hologram. "You thought we'd try to break you the usual way. Pain. Isolation. Maybe some drugs to mess with your head. But that's not how humans do things." He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. "We don't need to hurt you. We don't need to torture you. We just need to make you doubt." The Xylan's nostrils flared slightly, but he said nothing. Bonner smirked. "And right now, you're doubting everything, aren't you?" That Xylan clenched his jaw. Bonner continued, his voice calm, measured. "You're wondering if your fleet is already doomed. If the humans figured out some trick, some new tactic that your kind never saw coming. And worse, you're wondering if your people even know they've already lost." The Xylan's fingers twitched against the restraints. He exhaled slowly through his nose, controlling his breathing, but Bonner could see the tension growing. Bonner glanced back at the hologram. The Thailand fleet was still in chaos, warships drifting in disarray, officers scrambling for control. It was a beautiful sight. He took a sip of his coffee and sighed. "I've seen this before, you know." That Thailand flicked his eyes toward him. Bonner smiled. "It always starts the same way. Your people think they're invincible. You have the ships, the firepower, the numbers. You crush world after world, thinking nothing can stop you." He tilted his head slightly. "But then, you run into us." The Thailand's breathing hitched for just a fraction of a second. Bonner set his coffee cup down. "And that's where it all goes wrong, isn't it?" He gestured at the hologram. This was always going to happen. Your fleet scrambling, your officers panicking, your soldiers losing faith. The moment you started this war, it was inevitable." The Xylan's eyes darkened. "Lies," he muttered, his voice low. Bonner smiled. "Is it?" That Xylan clenched his fists, the energy restraints glowing faintly as they held him in place. We are stronger. We are more advanced. We have dominated countless civilizations. Your people. Bonner cut him off with a chuckle. Yeah. You're big, bad, and unstoppable. But tell me something. He tapped the table twice. If that's true, why do you look so worried? The Tylan's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't respond. Bonner leaned in slightly. You want to believe your people are still in control, that this is just a setback, that any moment now your fleet will regroup, and this little human resistance will be crushed. He tilted his head. But deep down, you know that's not how this ends. The Tylan said nothing. Bonner sighed, stretching his fingers. You ever wonder why we fight the way we do? He glanced at the restraints, then back at the alien's face. You think we enjoy it? The desperation, the sacrifices. You think we want to be the underdogs? The Tylan remained silent, but his gaze was locked onto Bonner's. Bonner's voice softened slightly. We don't fight because we want to. His eyes darkened. We fight because we have to. The Tylan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Bonner let the words sink in before continuing. You came to our worlds thinking we'd fall like the others. You thought we'd break, that we'd beg. But that's not how humans work. He leaned in, lowering his voice to just above a whisper. We don't beg. We endure. The Tylan's fingers curled slightly. Bonner smiled again, but this time, there was no humor in it. You underestimated us. And now, he nodded at the hologram. Now your fleet is learning the hard way what happens when you push humans too far. The Tylan's breathing was uneven now. His eyes flicked back to the screen, then to Bonner. Bonner knew he had him. The commander was trapped in his own mind now, spiraling through thoughts he couldn't stop. Doubt was taking root, twisting around his confidence like a slow, suffocating vine. Bonner leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. You can feel it, can't you? He chuckled softly. That nagging little thought in the back of your mind. The one whispering that maybe, just maybe, you're on the losing side. That Tylan clenched his teeth but didn't speak. Bonner gave him a slow, knowing nod. And that's why you're going to talk. The Tylan's eyes snapped to him. I will tell you nothing, he growled. Bonner's smirk widened. Oh, you will. He gestured toward the screen. Because right now, every second you stay silent, your fleet slips further out of your control. And the longer you hesitate, the worse it's going to get. That Tylan inhaled deeply, trying to regain control of his emotions. Bonner watched him carefully, then delivered the final blow. Here's the thing, he said, his voice almost sympathetic. You don't need to believe me. You don't need to trust me. But you do need to ask yourself one question. The Tylan hesitated. Bonner leaned in one last time. What if I'm right? The Tylan's breathing stilled. His mind raced. Bonner sat back, relaxed, and took another sip of his coffee. The trap was set, and it was tightening. The Tylan commander's breathing had changed. It was subtle, just a fraction too fast, a little too uneven, but Bonner noticed it. He noticed everything. The way the alien's fingers twitched against the restraints, the way his eyes flicked between Bonner and the hologram, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. He was unraveling, piece by piece. Bonner didn't press him. Not yet. He just let the moment stretch, let the silence settle into the alien's bones. The Tylan had spent his whole life being the one in control, the one who commanded fear. Now, for the first time, he was the one feeling it. Bonner took a slow sip of coffee, savoring the quiet. Then he set the cup down, tapping his fingers against the table in a slow, steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The Tylan flinched, just a little. Bonner smiled. You know, it's funny, he said casually, like they were discussing the weather. People always think breaking someone takes force, pain, threats. But that's not true. He tilted his head, studying the alien like a puzzle he was about to solve. Breaking someone is just about making them see the truth. The Xylan's jaw tightened. Bonner exhaled through his nose. You've been trained to resist interrogation, conditioned to withstand torture. But that's not what's happening here, is it? He gestured vaguely toward the screen. I'm not hurting you. I'm not shouting at you. And yet, he leaned forward slightly. You're still cracking. The Xylan's nostrils flared. I am not. Bonner raised a hand, cutting him off. No, don't lie to yourself. You feel it, don't you? That creeping doubt. That tiny voice in the back of your head whispering that something's wrong. His voice softened, almost gentle. And you hate it. The Xylan didn't respond, but his fingers curled slightly against the restraints. Bonner smiled. I get it. Really, I do. You were raised to believe your kind was superior, that no species could ever match you, that humans were just another footnote in your empire's history. He tapped the table twice. But then you met us, and suddenly, the story isn't going the way you thought it would. The Xylan's breathing hitched for just a second. Bonner noticed. You know what's happening out there, Bonner continued, nodding toward the hologram. Your fleet is collapsing. Your officers are panicking. You can hear it in their voices, see it in their eyes. They don't know what to do. He tilted his head. Because for the first time, they're losing. That Xylan clenched his jaw. We will recover. The Empire will. Bonner chuckled, shaking his head. No, you won't. He gestured toward the hologram again. You want to believe this is temporary, a setback. But deep down, you know the truth. He leaned in slightly. Your empire has never fought an enemy like us. Never fought a species that doesn't just resist, but adapts. The Xylan inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening against the restraints. Bonner gave him a knowing look. That's why you're struggling, isn't it? Because you're realizing, right here, right now, that everything you believed about this war was wrong. The Xylan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Bonner's voice dropped lower. You weren't ready for us. Silence. The Xylan's eyes flicked to the hologram again. His fleet was still in chaos. He could hear the scrambled voices of his officers, the desperate attempts to restore order. Ships were breaking formation, commanders shouting over each other. They were lost. They were afraid. The Xylan closed his eyes for just a second. A single second. Bonner saw it. He saw everything. He leaned forward, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. You know how this ends. The Xylan exhaled shakily. His composure was slipping, crumbling under the weight of the truth. He was fighting it, clinging to the last shreds of his belief in the Empire, in his people's superiority. But the doubt was there now, and it was growing. Bonner didn't let up. You've seen it happen before. Planets wiped out. Armies crushed. You've seen what happens when your people decide a species isn't worth the trouble. He paused, letting the silence stretch. But now, you're starting to wonder if maybe you're on the wrong side of that equation. The Xylan's breathing had quickened. Bonner sat back, crossing his arms. Here's the real problem, he said, tilting his head slightly. Your fleet isn't losing because we're stronger. It's losing because we're smarter. He let the words sink in. And if humans can outthink your people here, what do you think that means for the rest of your empire? The Xylan swallowed hard. Bonner smiled, slow and knowing. Yeah, you get it now. The Xylan's shoulders tensed. He looked at the hologram again, but this time, it wasn't with confidence. It was with realization, with fear. Bonner could almost hear the thoughts racing through his mind. If the humans have already crippled this fleet, how many more are waiting? What else have they figured out? How deep does this go? Bonner leaned in one last time, his voice barely more than a breath. You're already beaten. You just haven't admitted it yet. The Xylan's fingers twitched. His glowing yellow eyes locked onto Bonner's, searching, desperate. He was looking for something, anything, to prove him wrong. But there was nothing left. The truth had already sunk in. Bonner didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. And then, the Tylan did something he never thought he would. He lowered his head. Bonner exhaled through his nose, satisfied. The breaking point had arrived. The Island commander sat motionless, his head lowered, his breathing shallow. The weight of reality had finally crashed down on him. Bonner watched, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than any words. The alien's entire life had been shaped by the belief that the Tylan Empire was superior, that they were an unstoppable force destined to rule the galaxy. That belief had been shattered. The cold truth had sunk in. The humans were different. They were something the Empire had never accounted for. And now, that X-Island commander was left to face the consequences of that realization. Bonner let the silence stretch, knowing it would gnaw at the alien's mind. He reached for his coffee again, took a slow sip and sighed. "You feel it, don't you?" he said, his voice calm. "That moment when everything you thought was true turns to dust." That Tylan didn't respond. His fingers twitched against the restraints, but he didn't lift his head. Bonner continued, "I've seen this before. That moment of clarity. The second a soldier realizes they're fighting for the wrong side." He leaned back, stretching his arms. "It never gets old." That X-Island inhaled sharply, his shoulders rising with the breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "You still have not won." Bonner smirked. "Haven't we?" He gestured toward the hologram, where the Tylan fleet remained in chaos. "Your warships are falling apart. Your officers don't know what to do. And you." He tilted his head. "You're sitting here, doubting everything." The Xylan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Bonner leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "Tell me something," he said. "Why do you think you lost?" The Xylan's glowing yellow eyes flicked toward him, hesitation flickering within them. Bonner continued, "You outnumbered us. You outgunned us. You had more ships, more technology, more resources. So why are you losing?" The Tylan didn't answer. Bonner nodded slowly. "It's because you don't understand us." His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You never did." That X-Island exhaled heavily, his fingers curling into fists. "Humans are unpredictable." Bonner grinned. "Damn right we are." He leaned in. "Your kind fights wars like a machine. You calculate odds, weigh advantages, and expect battles to go exactly as planned." He tapped the table. "But humans? We don't fight like that." The Tylan remained silent, listening. Bonner's expression darkened. "We fight when we're outnumbered, when we're losing, when every logical choice says we should surrender." He shook his head. "But we don't. We adapt. We improvise. And when we've got nothing left." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "We still fight." That X-Island clenched his teeth, struggling against the truth he could no longer deny. Bonner let the words sink in before delivering the final blow. "That's why you lost. Because you thought this was just another conquest." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "You didn't realize you were fighting a species that doesn't know how to quit." That Tylan let out a slow, shaky breath. He looked at the hologram again. His fleet was spiraling into full collapse. Human ships were pressing the attack, exploiting every weakness. The once mighty Tylan armada was being torn apart, not just by superior tactics, but by sheer, relentless human tenacity. Bonner tilted his head. "And now, you have a choice." The Xylan's eyes snapped back to him. Bonner folded his hands on the table. "You can keep pretending this war isn't already over. Keep clinging to the idea that the Empire will recover." His voice hardened. "Or you can do the smart thing and save what's left of your people." The Xylan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He was still resisting, still trying to hold on to the last remnants of his pride. But Bonner could see it. the internal war raging inside him. Bonner sighed, shaking his head. "Let me tell you how this ends if you don't surrender." He pointed at the hologram. "Your fleet, gone. Your soldiers, dead. And your homeworld." His eyes darkened. "We'll burn it to the ground if we have to." The Hazelin inhaled sharply, his glowing eyes widening. Bonner nodded. "We don't want to. We don't take pleasure in it. But if you keep fighting, we'll end you." His voice was deadly calm. "Because that's what happens when you push humans too far." Silence. The Xylan's breathing was unsteady now. He was staring at Bonner, truly seeing him for the first time. Not as a lesser being. Not as a primitive species, but as something terrifying. Something unstoppable. Bonner let the silence stretch one last time before speaking. "So," he said, his voice almost casual, "what's it gonna be?" The Tylan didn't move at first. Then, slowly, his shoulders sagged. The fight drained from his body, replaced by something new. Acceptance. He exhaled shakily. "What do you want?" Bonner smirked. There it was. The surrender. He stood up, stretching. "Oh, don't worry. We'll get to that." He turned toward the door, knocking twice. The heavy metal locks hissed open. A pair of human officers stepped inside, their weapons at the ready. Bonner glanced back at the Xylan, his smirk widening. Welcome to the losing side. And with that, humanity had won. Again. The Xylan commander sat in silence as Bonner left the interrogation room, the heavy doors sealing shut behind him. The human officers led the alien away, his glowing yellow eyes dull with the weight of surrender. Bonner didn't look back. His work here was done. As he stepped into the dimly lit command center, the scent of burnt circuitry and sweat filled the air. Screens flickered with real-time data, displaying the collapsing Xylan fleet. Human warships, once scattered and outmatched, now tore through the enemy formations with brutal precision. The tides had turned, and humanity was about to deliver the final blow. Bonner walked up to the central holotable, where Admiral Kessler stood with arms crossed, watching the battle unfold. The older man barely spared him a glance. "Well?" Bonner smirked. "He broke." Kessler grunted. "Took you long enough." Bonner shrugged. "Had to make it dramatic." Kessler let out a dry chuckle before turning back to the screen. "We just intercepted a Xylan distress signal. What's left of their fleet is calling for reinforcements." Bonner's smirk didn't fade. "Let them. They won't get here in time." The holotable zoomed out, revealing the battlefield in its entirety. Xylan ships were in full retreat, their formations shattered. Human warships moved in coordinated strikes, exploiting every weakness. Fighter squadrons weaved between the debris, picking off stragglers. The once dominant Xylan fleet was crumbling, their centuries of conquest unraveling in a single decisive battle. A junior officer turned from his console. "Sir, that Xylan flagship is signaling surrender." A tense silence filled the command center. Every officer, every soldier had fought for this moment. For years, humanity had been on the defensive, running, hiding, barely surviving. And now they were the ones dictating the terms. Kessler exhaled slowly, patched them through. The central holoscreen flickered, revealing that Xylan Admiral. His once pristine uniform was torn, his expression grim. There was no arrogance now, no bravado, just a defeated warrior staring at the inevitable. This was not supposed to happen, the alien admitted, his voice laced with disbelief. "You were supposed to break." Bonner stepped forward, arms crossed. "Yeah, a lot of people made that mistake." The Xylan Admiral's mandibles clicked in frustration. He seemed to struggle with his next words. Finally, he exhaled. "What are your terms?" Kessler's gaze was cold. "Unconditional surrender. Immediate withdrawal from all human-occupied territories. Your remaining ships will stand down and submit to inspection." He leaned in. "And if we find out you're lying about anything, We finish what we started. The silent admiral's glowing eyes flickered with something. Anger, humiliation, or perhaps something deeper. Resignation. He knew there was no other option. Very well. The screen cut out. The command center remained silent for a moment longer, as if waiting for someone to wake them from the dream. Then, a single voice cheered, then another, and another. The room erupted into a roar of victory. Officers pounded their fists on the consoles, soldiers embraced each other, and cheers echoed through the ship's corridors. Across the fleet, human crews shouted in triumph. They had done it. Bonner felt a rare warmth in his chest. He had seen too much death, too much suffering, to celebrate like the others. But as he watched the battle unfold, the last Thailand ships standing down, the once invincible fleet in ruins, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Humanity had struck back. And this time, they weren't just surviving. They were winning.